All right, today we are going to review the first season of the HBO show Barry. Uh, why the heck am I reviewing this? Well, I don't typically watch much Western TV, and when I do, it's usually just sitcoms. I kind of just want like a background noise, something I can put on while I'm cleaning up, or while I'm talking with people, or I'm just doing something else in general. So I don't typically want things that require a lot of focus. If I really do think that I'm going to pay attention, there's a lot of anime that I want to get to. But there are exceptions to this. If something comes very highly recommended to me by multiple people, or something about the premise really strikes me, or something about the cast, whatever, I will go ahead and watch it, even if it's a more kind of substantial show than a sitcom. And probably the most relevant example here is Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad, absolutely nothing about the premise really appealed to me. Nothing about the emotions that I knew I would experience while I was watching it appealed to me, which is mostly just tension and suspense and suffering. But it just came so highly recommended. I was so convinced of its quality that I ended up watching it, and I don't regret it at all. A fantastic show. So if already would have said that this is another show that managed to convince me to watch it is enticing enough for you to check this show out, then I highly encourage you to just sit down and watch the first episode without reading anything more about it. The premise is pretty crazy, and I think going into it without knowing that premise could be quite an amazing experience. But on the other hand, I knew the premise going in, and I don't think it really ruined the show for me to any extent. I still really, really enjoyed it. Um, so if you'd like to learn more about it, I'm not going to spoil anything beyond just the basic premise, and we're going to talk more about why it works rather than what exactly happens. So this is your last warning. Okay, so the basic premise is this. Barry is this ex-Marine. He served in Afghanistan, and now he's back home, and he started doing hitman jobs, kind of contracted out by this friend of his father's. And on one of his hits, he goes to Los Angeles and stumbles into an acting class while trying to pursue his target. Instantly, he falls in love with the whole experience. He decides he wants to be an actor. He really gets along with all the people there. He's really just kind of over the moon with this idea. But of course, there's still. Oh, where did my mouse go? There's still lots of other sides to his life. There's still the remnants of this hitman job. And he has to juggle all of these things together, and it just becomes this gigantic mess. So there's kind of two major halves of the appeal of this show. There's the sitcom-esque appeal, and then there's the Breaking Bad appeal. This is a very simple Venn diagram. Don't worry, it's just a warm-up for a much more intense Venn diagram that's going to show up later. And in the middle, of course, we have the Barry Zone. And the Barry Zone is not occupied solely by Barry. There's actually quite a few other shows that I really like that manage to kind of land in the sweet spot where it has both the appeals of a sitcom and the appeals of an intense serial show like Breaking Bad. But I think this is a really good example of one, and we can use it to kind of break down how these shows work and why I think they're so good. So how does the sitcom appeal work? I would say the biggest part is that it's character-driven humor. We have people with wacky personalities that have strong conflicting desires. And the show is about everyone trying to get what they want, and how there's no elegant solution necessarily for everyone to meet their desires simultaneously, which leads to conflict, which leads to laughs. Usually sitcoms are quite episodic. This is no exception. The sitcom-esque stories within this usually are around one kind of clear problem that presents itself at the start of the episode and is kind of resolved by the end of the episode. This kind of structuring, I think, really lends itself well, that you just kind of set up this problem, we see what all of the characters want to get out of it, and then for the rest of the episode, they're kind of butting heads with each other, and then things are kind of taken care of by the end. I also like sitcoms that have zones of interaction, meaning that all of the characters are sort of divided up into geographical spaces, and that the main character kind of moves between them. This allows for nice A-B type plotting. It allows for like different types of humor in different zones without it kind of feeling too awkwardly juxtaposed or kind of self-defeating. So here, you know, there's the Chechen Mafia base, there's the acting school, there's the police station. All of these areas have different kind of sets of characters, different types of jokes being made, and we kind of bounce between all of them with these sort of sitcom plots, as each one kind of has their own challenges. And this is combined with the Breaking Bad type appeal. So here we have circumstance-driven intensity, where it's not really so much about necessarily the characters having like wacky personalities or wacky desires, things that are totally strange and irrational. Usually it's more that they have like one kind of smoldering, burning desire, which spans the entire series, and that it just keeps getting them into trouble, and it's more an accumulation of circumstances around them trying to get that goal that puts them into really intense situations where there's like very few options, very devastating results possible. Yeah, going through intense trauma, making difficult decisions, not just kind of wacky, now I want this, now I want that. There's long arcs that take place across episodes with like a compelling plot, stringing events causally together. And why this works so well with the sitcom appeal is that the moments of the greatest intensity on this side come from when the boundaries that we just established for the sitcom appeal kind of break down. So a character that trespasses from one zone to another zone. And even if both of those zones are presented typically comedically, that transgression, that trespass, can feel like suddenly very chilling and intense. Or a situation where you think that the problem ended at the end of one episode, and it seemed like that one episode had your typical little sitcom arc, but then the problem persists into the next episode and the episode after that. Again, this really kind of haunting, intense feel. Or in situations where you think a character is just kind of defined by this wacky goal or desire, something that seemed like it would burn out after one episode, but then you see that there's like an undercurrent of trauma or of true desire that synchronizes this character more into the longer arcs. So I think that's really amazing. Oops, I forgot to space this one out. These are all other things that I liked about it. So once I was kind of sold on this idea that it's somewhat of a sitcom, even though it has overall the structure of something more like Breaking Bad, I was also extremely impressed with all of this stuff. Cast, extremely strong. I love Stephen Root. I love Henry Winkler. I love Darcy Carden, who played Janet in The Good Place. I've just completely fallen in love with her after that performance, so I was so excited to see her again. And then other actors that I was kind of familiar with before, but had never really seen in such a starring role that I was really impressed with too. Bill Hader, Sarah Goldberg, Anthony Carrigan. The production in general is fantastic. I was so impressed with so many shots of this, just the cinematography, the mise-en-scene, things like that. I wasn't surprised at all to learn that some of my favorite episodes were directed by Hiromu Murai, who I think is one of my favorite directors working in television right now. The true legacy of Kubrick, and I don't say that lightly as a huge Kubrick fanboy, I think comes through in his framing and his shot selection. There's great thematic unity. So I kind of described two halves here. The plot is much messier than that, but generally speaking, there's like the acting class storyline and the hitman storyline. And within each episode, they do a really great job kind of having some thematic unity between what he's doing in each sphere. And this sort of thing, I think, needs the exact amount of weight to it. That if you make it too ham-handed and obvious, it's gonna feel more painful and just annoying and tedious than it would feel, you know, insightful or funny. But at the same time, if you make it like too hands-off, too subtle, then you get into situations where the characters seem almost blind to their own parallels and their own circumstances. So here we do see characters kind of remark on like, oh, isn't what we're doing in class kind of similar to this situation that we've been talking about, or blah, 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 like things like that. And that to me feels like a very natural kind of level of explicitness with these things. And I was also just impressed with how deftly the story kind of weaves itself together in these regards, that none of the developments on either side feel too forced or unnatural, and yet they nicely kind of sync up with each other again and again. The plot I found really completely enthralling. Typically, I do not marathon shows. I like to space things out and watch like an episode of something a week. But I just couldn't help it. I had a good opportunity to just watch a bunch of TV, and I really dove into this one. I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what happened next. I keep forgetting to animate these, but whatever. So I found Barry as a character really interesting too. I want to talk a little bit more about him as a character and why I think this is the best quality of the show is how they portray him. I always love it when the main character is my favorite because, of course, he's in almost every scene and most of the plot is about him. Most characters, when I watch a new show, I kind of examine archetypically. This, I think, is almost hard not to do in anime. That you're just kind of taking each character and comparing them to a whole list of characters that you've seen before that they remind you of. And I think this is fine. Like, it kind of sounds like I'm being critical that these characters are uninspired or repetitive. But it's more that it allows you to kind of have a framework that can be subverted or it can be fulfilled in a satisfying way or something like that. And if you like these archetypes, if you like seeing these types of characters, there's no problem to that. But Barry, I really could not get a read on. There's so many little details and clues that were given about his life, even from the very first opening shots of the series. And each one, I was like kind of surprised by. I tried to like kind of extrapolate and guess what details would follow, how he would behave in certain situations. And I was always like a little bit off. Like I was always a little surprised by what he did, like what he was capable of, what he was thinking, what he was saying. But every time it also just felt so right that it was still contributing to this one three-dimensional person, that it all fit nicely together as a holistic character development. And that was a pretty cool feeling to really feel like you're getting to know someone new, something that falls outside these archetypical bounds. So why is it? Why do I think that they were able to establish the character like this? Well, I think part of it has to do with the fact that Barry is often the exact center, the locus, the meeting point of many, many threads of dramatic irony, which feels very appropriate for a show about acting that deals so much with drama and kind of theatrical performance. So let's take the acting class. So this circle represents Barry's conception of the acting class. And it's a very small circle because he's quite a naive person and he thinks that everyone in the class, I think sincerely thinks that everyone in the class is en route to becoming a gigantic Hollywood star. So it's a very kind of naive and limited understanding of what the acting class is and what he's doing there. But then Sally, another major character played by Sarah Goldberg, has a much greater understanding of the acting class and the true potential of the students and such. And she might not understand completely the depths of Barry's naivety, but she certainly has a much larger understanding of the acting class. But then Jean, who runs the acting class, played by Henry Winkler, has a much greater understanding of it than Sally. So Barry, who's nested like 3 layers deep, looking up to both of these people, what hope does he possibly have of ever being able to conceive realistically who he is as an actor or where he is in the acting class? But of course, that's not the only thing going on. There's also the hitman job. And of course, Barry knows quite a bit more about the hitman job than the acting class, represented by the circle being bigger. What can I say? I have a natural flair for graphic design. Not that I think these are like actually proportionally meaningful or anything, but just, you know, relative to each other, you can see what I'm going for here. But Barry's hitman job, despite the fact that he's a complete expert and one of like a world-class hitman, is nothing compared to Fuchsia's, who's his father's friend, who's kind of like his hitman contractor, paid by Stephen Root, whom I love, which is much larger. And then the Chechnins, their major contractors for this season, have a large and totally different understanding of the situation too. Well, not totally different. Of course, there's some overlap, but you can see what I'm saying, where Barry, again, is at this absolute locus where everyone around him kind of knows better what's going on and also knows differently from each other, or conceives of these situations differently from one another. But the important point is that Barry in these situations is always the most ignorant. And yet, Gene and Sally are totally ignorant of Barry's hitman job. And the Chechnins and Fuchsias, they don't really understand why Barry is in this acting class or the appeal that it has to them. The audience really understands most of what's going on in general and has like a complete superset of certain situations, and can kind of see through the bullshit of various characters and such. Then, of course, there's also the perspective that some characters have on these external situations to themselves, which I've represented by these triangles of vision, all of which, again, kind of swirling around Barry. And please note that there could be yet another entire nesting with the police, various people's understanding of the investigations in progress, Barry's understanding of how incriminated he is or isn't, so on and so forth. Yet another gigantic nesting spiraling out in another direction. But the point is that only in the very, very middle, in this tragically thin place, can we actually say that there is a complete understanding of Barry by himself. That only in this epicenter of delusions and obligations and responsibilities and investigations is what we could call like Barry's self-awareness. And it's this tiny, tiny, tiny little thing that is always kind of getting tripped up and tricked. And yeah, it's sad. It's quite a tragic situation. And yet, Barry is also a locus of action. So he's nested deep within these complex patterns that kind of obscure the reality of the situation from him. That we always know things aren't actually quite the way he assumes they are. There are some kind of symmetries, as we saw in the structure, which kind of give it that sitcom appeal, that he finds himself ignorant in different spheres of his life, kind of creating those A and B plots. But then there's also some really tense hierarchies, where there are people that strictly know better than him, and there's certain spheres that if they interacted, one would certainly trump the other completely. Actually, now that I think of it, there's kind of a nice rock, paper, scissors between the police sphere, which really can't do anything to the acting class, but would bust the Chechnins if given the opportunity, the Chechnins who can just murder everyone in the acting class if they want, but fold to the police, and the acting class, of course, fits the third profile there. So yeah, just that kind of tension between these spheres, which could just annihilate each other if coming into contact, then leads to this Breaking Bad style, where you're always waiting for the next breakdown between structures set up by previous episodes. And in the middle is Barry, who is really ignorant most of all of this kind of structuring around him and seems very oblivious to these sort of things happening. And yet, despite being in this ignorant position, he always has a lot of power. He's always capable of so much. He has all sorts of competence. He's actually like a very intelligent person in certain ways. Within his understanding of the situation, he has a lot of confidence and resolution that when he knows he has to do something, he just gets it done. He's quite an unwavering person in many regards. But very little agency. And one of the major themes of the story is because of these gigantic structures around him and this gigantic chaotic mess that he finds himself directly in the middle and the epicenter of, he always just is doing what he feels he has to. Almost every decision he makes, he thinks that there is no other choice. And kind of seeing the situations where he tries to wrestle agency back and do things on his own, and how that leads him only further into ignorance, into dramatic irony. Really is kind of the overall progression of this series. So this combination really feels unique and compelling to me. I think the closest I can compare it to is like kind of a Shakespearean hero that has these sort of tragic flaws, these blind spots and misunderstandings, and yet is like always questing, is always in a position of competence and influence, and yet in the end is can't really get anything done. That everything sort of returns to the same regardless. So really kind of fascinating to me structurally, this story. Hopefully some of that made sense to you. Man, I keep forgetting to animate these. Whatever. So I do have some complaints. I think it leans a little too heavily on one kind of subversive type of humor, which generally I quite like, which is where this extreme seeming person turns out to be surprisingly reasonable, just kind of chatty and funny and down to earth. Um, and it was consistently funny whenever they made these jokes. But sometimes it feels like it's too exposed, the functionality of trying to almost have your cake and eat it too. There's like a scene where somebody is like, they're chatting on the phone, and the one guy knows that the other guy just like betrayed him pretty hard. And he's like, well, like I'm not some like bloodthirsty monster. I've been reading these like self-help books, and they like chat about self-help books, and it's very funny. But at the end of the conversation, he's like, well, like I got to do it anyways. Like I'm gonna have to like get you back for this, and it feels a little forced that they need to still advance the plot with this conflict, and yet they want to just get some like free humor, I guess, by kind of framing it this way and characterizing them this way. So it kind of, whenever I see these really blatant kind of have your cake and eat it too type situations where you need the plot to advance a certain way, but you also just want to do the humor that seems like inherently incompatible with that, I just kind of find it a little straining, I guess. But it's fine. I also think some of the characters behave in kind of with blind spots, that situations that happened to them in the past don't feel like they should, like that they affect them enough. That the characters just kind of bounce back and recover perhaps abnormally quickly. And I'm not really sure if this is deliberate, and I'm not sure like who exactly this is like a reasonable character trait to, that they just do move on as a person like this. Um, it totally reads to me that a lot of these characters could be like that. The other thing too is that in later seasons, and because I know season 2 is airing right now, these things could still come back. Like the trauma could just be written in deeper to the character. So I think that's fine too. Or it could just be a gloss. And again, it just sort of feels like a cake eat type situation, that you want to have the full devastating effects of certain things, and this is generally very well done and leads to some really fantastic performances and stuff. But then the plot also needs to keep moving, and it needs to still be able to hit all of the tonal notes that it normally does. And as a result, it sometimes feels like those scenes have less of an impact than they would sensibly have. So I don't know. We'll see. I also think that it starts kind of awkwardly because the premise is just so bizarre, and so much of what happens near the start is just kind of like setting up plot points quite quickly. When you're first watching it, I feel like it's a little awkward, and you probably won't think it's too good. Having gone back and rewatched the first few episodes with my dad after I first watched it, I kind of appreciated it more, and I recognize that any sort of stumbling is worth it to get where it's going. Um, so I think season 2 could be even better in this regard because they don't need to do all of this setup work. They can just kind of smoothly go into the plot. So all things considered, I would give this a 9. I was very, very pleased with it. I highly recommend it to anyone who likes kind of high concept sitcoms, something like classic Arrested Development, or kind of the more complex arcs in Curb Your Enthusiasm or things like that. Or if you like just really well done, high tension, uh, serial stories like Breaking Bad or something like that. Either way, either half of it, I would really recommend this show. I think it's fantastic. And now that I've made this review, I feel like I can start watching season 2. So that's great. Probably going to watch some of that tonight. Yay! All right. That's all for now. Bye-bye.